Okay, thanks so much. Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to our colleagues on the East Coast, in Europe. My name is Alyssa Sykes, and I lead the customer marketing team here at Workday. Thank you so much for joining the webcast. On today's webcast, we are so excited to welcome Avis Budget Group, a leading provider of mobility solutions, operating 3 of the most recognized brands in the industry through Avis, Budget, and Zipcar. Our special guest is Sherry Nazak, Vice President of HR Transformation and HRIS. Sherry will share her experience in developing the case for Avis's HR transformation, the global rollout of Workday, and to answer your questions about life as a Workday customer. But first, why don't we get to just a bit of housekeeping on the next slide. As you all know by now, this is a Zoom-based webcast, so you'll be able to access the webinar through either your computer or you can dial in using your headset. There's a Q&A widget down at the bottom of your screen, and that's how we'll handle live Q&A after Sherry's presentation. So you'll just go ahead and enter your questions into that Q&A widget. We are recording the webinar, as you can tell, and that'll be distributed after we get off the call. So why don't we look a little bit at our agenda here. We're going to introduce Sherry and not postpone that any longer. Sherry will share her experience with Avis and through their HR transformation, and then we'll take live Q&A. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible, and thanks in advance to those of you who pre-submitted some questions. So with that, I'm not going to take any more of your time. I will turn it over to you, Sherry, and thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining and giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about our story in terms of our HR transformation and our journey with Workday. So what I'll start with today is just a bit of an overview about our organization, in terms of what we do and kind of directionally where we're going. So this will give you a bit of an outline in terms of our size and scope. Avis, Budget, Zipcar are probably the most known brands here in the U.S. Internationally. There's quite a few others that fall under our umbrella, such as France Cars, Apex in the New Zealand region, etc. So, but probably the couple of points that are worth mentioning beyond just the numbers is, organizationally, we are going through quite a bit of transformation as a whole. As everybody I'm sure is aware, the marketplace is changing considerably in terms of how people want to get from point A to point B. It's not always by rent-a-car now. There's many different modes of transportation out there. So we are really working through a transformation as an organization of making sure that we have relevance in that new world and really kind of expanding beyond thinking about the rent-a-car model and really thinking about truly moving from point A to point B and how do we find the things that we do best in our organization and then apply those in those different markets. So kind of that's a little bit of a backdrop around organizationally where we're moving toward, and then really focusing on our organization probably, maybe 6-7 years ago was really very North America centric. And most of the European market was a licensee for us. So they ran the business independently. And about 6 or 7 years ago, that all got brought back together. So we've really also been going through the work, not only in the HR function, but in the rest of the business around how do we now begin to operate as a global organization with all those behind the scenes systems and ways of working, et cetera. So that's just a little bit about the backdrop of us as an organization, kind of where we are sitting currently. So when we started to take a look at building out the HR business case for our transformation, we had probably 2 to 3 attempts prior to 2015 of really focusing on that international market because we had no HR system at all. Every country did something different, and there was no way to tie that information together. And so we had made some attempts to go after just getting a core HCM system for our international region a couple of times and really struggled with trying to get through the financial approval process. And, when it comes to conversations around ROI and things like that, that really was a tough sell. So in 2015, we kind of really took a totally different look at it and said, let's not think about it just from a system perspective, but let's look at it as an entire function. So I was, kind of as we embarked down this road, I was lucky enough to have a CHRO that said, you know what, it's not that we do everything wrong at this point, but there's nothing that we do so perfectly that we couldn't do it better. So everything's up for grabs. Take a look at the organization as a whole. So we went through about a 6-month analysis phase of really figuring out what we actually did in kind of all of these areas that you see on the screen, and what could we potentially do better in those areas. And really what came out of that was this business case for HR transformation, which really took all of the work and bucketed into these really 4 big categories. Obviously focusing on cost, what can we do to control and reduce our costs? The infrastructure piece was certainly, kind of the foundational piece was a global system that we could tie all of the business together from a people perspective on. Taking a look at our structures. So if we're going to do things differently, how should we be operating, and what should our operating model be as we move into the future? And then taking a look at some of the big significant processes that exist within the business, and really taking a hard look at, are we doing them right? Is there a better way to get at it in terms of how we should be handling these processes within the organization? So that really laid out the entire business case, which really, when you put all of that together and kind of present it as the core of this system, that is kind of, the foundational piece, but then all of this can come with it, if we start there. And that really changed the dynamic and put us in a much better position from a business case perspective to kind of get that buy-in throughout the rest of the organization. So, why we chose Workday. So we had done, as I mentioned, because we had a couple of kicks at the can, prior to 2015, we had done quite a bit of due diligence around what systems were out there, what were the potential options we had when we started to look for a system. And, here we kind of outlined just a few of the reasons why we chose Workday. First, we certainly wanted something that was going to be able to cover our geography. And when you looked out over the globe to make sure that we could cover even, countries big and small, we wanted to be able to get everybody into one system. Second, we wanted to make sure that we could cover all the modules that we needed. So all the systems that we wanted to touch in terms of making them better as we move toward the future. And one of the things that was really appealing is having it all in one system. We had come from a place, at least on the US side of the business, where we had a system for merit and we had a system for performance, and we had an HCM, but they were all completely separate systems. So the time and effort that was spent on trying to pull that data together and be able to use it as one was very difficult. So picking a solution that would allow us to do that easily was certainly very high on our list. And then certainly as we did our research and kind of got to see the system and use the system, the user experience, how it looked to the average employee that would be going into the system, how intuitive it was certainly very important to us. And then, I think probably the final point there would be the fact that the system was ever changing and ever growing. Because we are going to change and grow as we move along. So making sure that there's something happening from a systems perspective that it's going to allow us to keep pace with what we need to do in the business were all things that we felt were really critical and were key to making our decision to choose Workday. So once we did that, then it was time to actually get started and kind of determine what was going to be the scope that we wanted to cover with our implementation. So you can see here on the left are the items that we considered in our initial functional scope. So that's where we started. Those were the modules that we went with to begin with. And then we more recently actually just went live a couple of months ago with learning. So that was kind of a second phase. When we decided our initial scope, there were kind of 2 areas that we said we're going to hold on those and come back to. One of those was learning. The other one was talent acquisition. So this kind of laid out what our initial scope was, and you can see here are from about 27 countries, 30,000 employees, and a huge variation of systems that existed out there that we were going to be needing to pull together and operate as one when we were done with this implementation. So because we had so much of this diversity out there and everybody was starting from a different place, from a country that might have a system that handled everything for them, but it was a local system, to a place that was maybe still using a spreadsheet, and that was it. That really led into kind of how we looked at our project timeline, which was a very aggressive timeline, no doubt about that. But we really felt that there was a couple of things at play here. One, we had in our head business fatigue. So how long could we be going through this process before we started to either, one, lose interest or lose buy-in from the organization because we still didn't have anything in place. So we wanted to be very cognizant of that. The other is that because we had so many different pieces and parts, we really felt like Big Bang was the best option for us, which was obviously a very aggressive approach, but we really couldn't see how we were going to be able to build out pieces of the process or certain regions of the business and then try to pull the others in without having them be part of that discussion right up front. The other thing that played into it was, you can see here that we went with a global design workshop. So we wanted to get everybody involved in that process of deciding what was the system going to look like in the future. And what we decided to do is we didn't take any one of the models as our starting point. We actually wanted to be very neutral about it and start with what is the basic process that exists in Workday when you get it? What comes out of the box? And now from there, let's build in the things that we really think we need to have. So what are the things that we need to come to agreement on that we can do the same around the organization? And then knowing that there would be some things that were going to have to be specific to particular countries, et cetera, for legal reasons and things like that. So we went through a global design workshop where for 2 weeks, we had representation from every country in the room. We started with a base process, and then we debated, discussed, and came to agreement on what that process would look like, at a global scale. And then once that was complete, we took that and then we did 4 localization workshops, so at 4 points around the globe, and then kind of did a deeper dive into each of those processes and really had some hard discussions around, if a country felt like they needed to do it differently, why was that? And really kind of set up at the beginning as part of our guiding principles that if we're going to do it different, we're only going to do it different because we have to. And that have to is a legal requirement, a governmental requirement, et cetera, things like that. But other than that, we need to find a way to find a process that brings us all together. So this gives you kind of an idea of what that overall timeline looked like to get us to go live, which we did hit. We were able to get there. Probably one of the biggest reasons that I think we were able to hit that timeline is really the governance that we had in place. And this had buy-in from every part of the organization. So if I kind of start at the bottom and build up, the program leadership committee was when you broke out all of those modules, and each of those modules had a lead. And then, of course, there was a team underneath them that they, did a lot of the day-to-day work around what we should do, how we were going to do it. And then once a week, we took the leads of each of those groups, and we would have a meeting where we would walk through timelines, we would walk through any decisions that needed to be made, we would check on progress, and then have discussion around anything that was problematic or things that might have come up that needed resolution. And then that then bubbled up to the Global Leadership Board, which I think was probably the most key component for us to be able to move at the pace that we did, which was essentially the direct reports to our CHRO. So that kind of gave you full representation of the business. And as a program leadership team, our goal was to bring to that team on a weekly basis any decisions that we needed to make around the design, how we were going to handle things in a system, other decisions that needed to be made that maybe weren't in the system, but would impact what we built within the system. And we spent a lot of time making sure that those decisions were clearly articulated, so we knew exactly what the decision was they needed to make. And we would then build out what are the key points that you need to know in order to be able to make this decision. And then we would make a couple of options around what the decisions could be. And then, of course, our recommendation of what we thought the decision should be. And we agreed that coming into that meeting that we would not leave those meetings until we had those decisions made. And that's what really allowed us to move at the pace that we needed to move at. And then the steering committee at the kind of the highest level was really about oversight and kind of report out on our progress. And if there was a major roadblock that we couldn't clear for some reason, typically wasn't around system decision things, but delays in other departments that we were dependent on, or things of that nature, is where we would bring those decisions. And we, on a very regular basis, had the CFO, our CIO, always the CHRO in attendance in those meetings. Biweekly was a very strong cadence. Typically, you wouldn't have a steering meeting that often, but again, because of the pace we were moving at and the rate we needed to make decisions, we felt like that was critical. And so having that tight timeline and making sure that all the right decisions were being made at the right levels allowed us to really stick to our timeline there. And then, at the beginning of the process, we very clearly defined what are those guiding principles, what are the things that have to be true. We have to make this global. We only do localization when it's legally required. We have to think about the simplest way to do things. We don't plan for the exceptions, things of that nature. And then, essentially through this process, we've made probably over about 150 decisions. And this is a process, not the entire process, but certainly an idea of the Global Leadership Board and the way that we make decisions is something that's carried through even beyond implementation. So as you start down the road of the implementation process, there are quite a few key decisions that have to be made early on. And some of those are tough because you don't yet know. If you haven't used the system yet, you don't exactly know how this is going to go when you try to make these decisions. So you kind of have to use your best judgment. So I'm going to focus on the 4 that we've highlighted in blue here because I think these are some areas where I feel like we probably had the most lessons learned, where now when I think back, I don't necessarily know that I would change it, but my thought process around how we made those decisions would probably have been a little bit different. So the first is around the staffing model, which was, how much control and how much information do you want to be able to have around the positions that exist in your organization? Now, we decided that we really wanted to know as much as we probably could because we were coming from a place where we really didn't know much at all. So we went with position management across the board, which means that every single, position in your organization has a specific position, and it's not just generic in nature. And I think probably the lesson learned from that for us is that within our business, we have kind of a more corporate office, white collar based population, but then we also have a field-based population that are cleaning cars, shuttling cars, renting cars, et cetera, and those roles obviously have a higher turnover rate, and there's a lot of movement there. Getting the management team to understand the concept of position management and how they have to use that in order to fill roles has proven to be a little bit tricky. It's a lot of information for them to absorb at that level in the organization. So, job management gives you a little more flexibility to say it's a generic position, you fill it. Might have been a better option for those hourly positions. Not so much for the office headquarters types positions. And then looking at employee self-service and manager self-service in terms of that strategy, we went all the way. And when I say all the way, I mean we went with all of our processes that we built out. We had the initiator of those processes be at the lowest levels within the organization that you could. So for any sort of a management related task, that happens at an entry-level manager position, and of course all the way up. And then employees have access to as much as they can through self-service. I think the employee side has been fine. Again, similar to the position management thing, for managers, for some of those things that we've allowed them to do, it might have been a little more than they can have the expertise for around, when you're creating a position, being able to choose the right job profile and the right grade, and then the kind of the knock-on impacts of if they make the wrong decisions there. That's an area that we're kind of going back and taking a little bit of a relook at to make sure that we have that right. Organizational structures is really, my point there would be in terms of the lessons learned would be thinking about how your organization is set up, but then also thinking about on the back end, how are you going to want to view that organization from a reporting standpoint to make sure that the way that the organization is created is going to allow you to get that data out of the back end the way that you need to. We have a very diverse organizational structure. We have different segments of business, and each of those segments of business kind of structure their organization very differently. And because we don't have a lot of alignment there, it makes it a little more difficult on the back end to get reporting kind of broken out the way that you might want to, or way the business might want to see it, as opposed to the way that we have it structured in the system. And then mobile device strategy, the one point I wanted to make there is, as you move through, depending on what modules you go with, depending on what pieces you implement, this might be a non-issue to a bigger issue, but what we've seen is, basic access to the system for an employee around, being able to change their personal contact information or things like that is fine. When you start to move into the arena like we have now with learning, where now employees are going to be able to use their phone to access training, take training, record videos to create training, etc., now we start to move in a space from a legal perspective where it starts to get very sticky. In terms of, and this depending on where you are in the world and the type of employee population you have also will have an impact on this. So for us, with a large hourly population that do not have access to a computer, that do not have, company devices that they can use, they are using a personal device. So now you start to get into business reimbursement issues, privacy issues, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely something to think about. And again, depending on the types of modules that you're going with, could certainly play a role in your decision making there. After going through this process, some of the benefits that we've gotten as we've moved through is essentially having one source of truth. Coming from a place where we've had many different systems and no way to pull that data together. In our international business, prior to moving to Workday, our president would ask, how many employees do we have? And it quite literally was a 3-week exercise. And by the time he got that number back, it actually wasn't even true anymore because so much had changed in between. So having a place where we have everyone and, there's no ancillary systems, no side systems, has made a huge impact on our ability to access data and respond to the business needs in terms of the types of data that they may need. That ties very closely into what I have here on number 2, which is now that we have that, it does make it easier to help to drive some of that globalization that needs to happen in the rest of the business. So as other functions, other departments, other groups start to look at other systems, 9 times out of 10, that system is going to need some sort of people data. And now we have a place where they can go to get that people data, but that also means that we're going to have to align the way that they set up that system to make sure that we can make it talk to Workday the way that we need to. So it kind of helps to push in the direction of making sure we have one way of doing things. For example, before we had one system, we probably had 4 or 5 different versions of an employee ID. Something as simple and basic as that. That now there's only one and it comes from one place. So things like that, the way that we set up fields, the way that we name things of that nature, you start to drive some uniformity beyond just the HR function, just by the nature of you're the keeper of that source data. And then obviously, the ability to create some standardization around process, the way that we handle things. One of the things that we set up as part of this process in terms of when we looked at structure was a shared service center. So really building the processes from scratch that, we took as much of that admin or system work and put that into our shared service centers as we could so that we could eliminate the amount of work that sat within the business, but then that also allowed us to standardize the way that we did things. So really standardization and efficiency were kind of the big key words when we looked at any of the processes that we went through. And this is something that we continue to do as we move forward, is to think about, constantly think about what other work could we move into that shared service center environment, and how, if we are going to revise or change the way that we do processes, is there again more that we could push into that environment and take it off of the business, so that, the HR population within the field is really spending their time interacting with the business and being a true business partner, and not doing a lot of administrative heavy type work. And then the last point on here around the standardization of position creation and comp governance. So we, again, prior to this move, because we really operated very differently internationally and within the US, we had very different comp structures. So you couldn't say, the person who is, renting a car in the US, essentially is doing the same job as a person renting a job in international, but, their grades were totally different, their titles were totally different, et cetera. So working to come up with a structured comp model that fit globally, and now that we can tie that into the system with position creation and what exists there, you then have the ability to kind of control some governance around that and make sure that we stick with that and things don't, get diluted or watered down as you move down through the organization. So the last piece I'll touch on is kind of what's next. So what are we working on now? What are some of our big target areas that we're focusing on? And the first one on here is Design Council. The idea behind Design Council is that we did all of this work to kind of come up with a operating model for the organization, ways of working, redid the way that we do, the HR structure from a staffing perspective works, et cetera. But how do we make sure that we keep that? Because as people move on with their lives and, do day-to-day work, it kind of naturally happens that things will start to vary and somebody will make a decision without somebody else knowing. So the idea behind Design Council is that this is a place where any decisions that are going to have an impact on the overall model, that are going to have an impact on the way that we've configured the system, that we have a place that we bring relevant representatives from each part of the HR function together, and we make those decisions together, so that if we're going to deviate from the model, we do it knowingly and not by accident, because somebody didn't communicate with someone else. Continuous improvement is always something that we're focusing on. We are constantly re-looking at our processes. As things change within the Workday environment, as things change within our business, there's always an opportunity to go back and say, what can we change? What can we do different? How do we make things better? The HRIS function is something that when we moved to Workday, we literally changed out, well, at the time, we only had an HRIS function that supported North America, because that's the only place where we had a consistent system. So now moving to the model of providing global support and moving to an entirely new system, we ultimately ended up changing our HRIS model and the people within it. So, we are kind of still working through our rebuilding stages. I think we probably spent the last 2 years probably doing more firefighting and just making sure that we're fixing things and making sure people are clear on how they're supposed to do things, et cetera. But now we're to the point where we can start thinking, more proactively around how do we continue to add value to the business? How do we continue to stay on top of what's coming next within Workday, so that we're continuing to push out things that are changing and things that need to improve. And then the last piece on here is around leveraging Workday Learning. So as I mentioned, we literally just went live a couple of months ago, and I am very pleasantly surprised at the reaction to it from the business. So, we went from probably what was a very typical LMS type system, log in, find a training course, whatever, and you can take it, to a very different model of, more YouTube-like environment, which is we really are pushing. Yes, obviously we have some standardized training around compliance or new hire training, things of that nature, but really the piece that we want to push is that everybody out in the business are truly the experts. So you tell us what are the best ways to do things and what are the helpful tips and things that are useful to you. So we're really pushing the model of people creating videos How-to videos, very much like a YouTube type environment. When you want to know how to do something, you go to YouTube, and I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll show you. Going with that model, and it's really taken off very quickly. The other thing that is kind of a good byproduct of that has been is that for our hourly population up to this point, there probably wasn't a ton of reasons that they needed to go into Workday on a regular basis. I mean, how often do you change your contact details? You know, how often do you need to do some of those other things? But now this is something that is driving more people on a regular basis into the system, which really then only makes it easier for us to continue to add more and more, because we're going to get those hourly employees going in there and using the system on a much more regular basis. So those are kind of some of the big ticket items that are next for us. And then obviously, you know, beyond, when you looked at that business case at the beginning, you know, that was a 3 to 5 year roadmap. So there's still some of that work that will continue on, you know, at least for the next year or so, for us to kind of get that whole original business case wrapped up and completed.
Well, Sherry, that was just fantastic. Thank you so much. I am sure that many of the folks on the line have questions for Sherry, so you know, please don't hesitate. You can feel free to go and enter your questions into that Q&A widget down at the lower part of your Zoom window, and you can do that now if you wish. But we do already have some questions in the queue, so we'll just kind of get right to them. So Sherry, one quick question, just kind of setting the context. Can you share with everyone who your deployment partner was?
Yes, it was Accenture.
Great. And you know, you spent a little bit of time talking about the business case for the HR transformation and as an enabler of the business transformation. Can you share a little bit about, you know, how long did your team spend on building the business case? Who was involved?
Sure. Building the business case was probably about a 6-month process. So we spent, I would guess, probably about a month to 2 just gathering data. And that initial team to do that work was a very small team. It was me and 3 consultants that started down that road of just kind of pulling all that data in and starting to take a look at where we were. Then we spent a couple of months then starting to build out those recommendations, what we thought would be the right thing, and then starting to cost that out, build in the costing information, et cetera. And then started kind of the socialization process. So, you know, ultimately we were going to have to go in front of our senior leadership team to present the business case to get approval. But we went with a model of saying, okay, before we get in there in front of the group of everyone all together, let's go and have some one-on-ones with each of those members and kind of walk them through the case, answer some of the questions that might be more specific to their world, you know, that maybe they wouldn't ask in a big group, or, you know, having to field all that when you were in, you know, kind of that final session. And that proved to be really useful, because by the time we then got to that final approval meeting, we'd had most of the questions answered. You know, everybody was clear and comfortable with what we were presenting, and allowed us to tweak, you know, what we had in the case if we needed to, so that by the time we got to that final meeting, we were, you know, pretty close to there, and it became a little bit more of a formality versus actually being the place where we had our discussion.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. You know, we'll get to some questions about kind of staffing and how you supported, you know, kind of during implementation, post-implementation. You know, maybe while we're kind of early in the conversation, you can share, you know, what did your support model look like internally, and then with your deployment partner, Accenture, kind of during implementation? Okay.
We had internally, we were definitely more deployment partner heavy. I mean, that was the bigger chunk of the team. Internally, we had internal people that ran each of those functional areas, and then the people that worked on each of those teams were internal. So I probably had about, I would say maybe 15-ish that were 100% dedicated to the project all the time. And then there were definitely people that participated along the way. So if we were spending a lot of time on compensation, then obviously much more of the compensation team was involved during that portion, but they also had their day job and didn't do it 100% of the time. Then on the deployment side, I had kind of my counterpart, kind of leading the Accenture team. We worked very closely together. And then they supplied, I had one person on my side doing project management, and then we had, I think, 2 people on their side, and then kind of a whole host of people on their side that moved in and out depending on the module that we were on. So we definitely had people that were functional experts in each of the major functional areas. And then obviously quite a bit when we moved to integrations and more the technical side of the business, there was a pretty extensive offshore team that was in there. So I think probably at our peak, if you put it all together, we were probably in the range of 30-ish, close to 40 maybe.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so can you share with the attendees again, why did you choose to do Big Bang versus a phased rollout?
Sure. So for us, when you were thinking about, when we started to look at what we were looking to put in place, the big decision factors was, one, the fact that we were just so spread out all over the place, and we really wanted to get to the place of one model. We felt like we had to include everybody to do that. But probably the biggest driver was that we wanted to set up shared service centers. So we did one international and one in the US. And we felt like if we didn't go Big Bang, we would then have to go back and rework our process configuration when we did stand up each of those countries. So, we built out our Workday processes to say, step 1, 2, and 3 happen in the business, and then steps 6 through 8 happen in the shared service center, and then it moves on. If we didn't have everybody on the same model, we would have had to have 2 versions of business processes, and then we would have to go through a process of consolidating that down on the back end. And we felt like that was going to be just way too much rework. So we went with the option of just doing it all in one go.
Okay, that's great. There's a question about, you talked about kind of learning not necessarily being part of that original scope. Can you talk a little bit about why learning wasn't included in the original scope, and whether it was related to capacity to be a full learner, management system?
Well, some of it was, probably the biggest piece of it was that, for the size of team that we had and the amount of work that we needed to accomplish, we thought we had more than we could handle, actually, because I think the bigger piece of it is that, what we chose to do, which, made this, a very aggressive plan and took a lot of work, is that we weren't coming from a place of, we have a compensation system and a compensation structure in place, so now we just need to figure out how to map that into Workday. We were coming from a place of, we're going to completely redo our compensation system and at the same time figure out how to get it configured in Workday. And so it was the same thing with each of those major bucketed areas. So on performance, we completely revamped the way that we did performance and tried to build it into the system at the same time. So with that amount of work, and we knew from a learning perspective that we would want to do that same thing. And at the time felt like that was just too much to take on. And then the other component that that kind of helped make those decisions for us for why we left kind of learning and talent acquisition out were that those were the 2 pieces that had the most direct impact on the business on a day-to-day basis. And what I mean by that, from a learning perspective, our rental sales agents at the counter, sell ancillary products. If we can't teach them how to sell those ancillary products, then our change in system is going to affect the revenue of the business. So while we're trying to do all this other stuff, let's tackle that when we can make sure we can devote, enough time and attention to it to make sure that we don't have an impact on the business. And that was the same thing with talent acquisition, is that if we can't hire people, then we are directly impacting the business. And that was, with everything else we were trying to accomplish, just a little too much to handle.
Great. Thanks so much. One of the slides that you talked about was around some of the key decisions that you were making. While you were making some of those key decisions, could you tap into other Workday customers for their advice or experience?
We did, I guess, indirectly, because that was what we leveraged Accenture for, was to give us, with all the other companies that you've done deployment with, kind of what did they do? So we did do a couple, but the most of it, partly because to the timeline that we had to keep to, we really relied on Accenture for a lot of that to give us some best practice from other organizations.
Great. Okay, we're going to get into some questions, really since you've been live. So kind of comparing your staffing models, what does your HR tech team look like now, the team that supports Workday?
That is something that it does look very different than it did when we started. I think we were probably a little bit naive when we first started out in terms of the amount of support that we thought we would need to support the system. So now, so at the beginning, we had really only, I think, 2 onshore people. We had decided up front that we were definitely going to do a split model of some onshore support that were ABG employees, and then we were going to have some offshore support, and we were going to partner with Accenture to do that, to give us some additional, for some of the processing work, et cetera. So we knew that was going to be our model. We were very light on the onshore support when we started out, as I said, 1 to 2 people. And then, then we had our offshore team. Now we've kind of moved to a model where we definitely have more onshore resource. I've got 5, the manager plus 4, that are focused strictly on HRIS, systems related type things. And then I've got 2 that are focused on reporting. And then we've got about 7 offshore that are kind of split, with 3 people that are focused on functional work, so configuration work, system implementation type work, things like that, and then 4 that are focused on security and integration work.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. A couple questions about payroll and time. Are there plans to implement either of those applications? If not, who are you using now?
So for payroll and time, one of the things that was part of our original business case was workforce planning. And as we reviewed that business case with the senior leadership team, the decision was made at that point that actually there was so much there that actually should break off as a separate project. So there's a separate project team that did that. So, and when we took a look at workforce planning, time and attendance fit very closely into that. We have a very, very complex hourly population. And if you broke our population, it's about a 70-30 mix. So 70% of the population fill those field roles. And there are a lot of different union implications, contracts, et cetera. And certainly one of our big lessons learned that came from, and it's not wrong, it was just that's how we were, is that when you don't have systems tying you together, then you make decisions that are very local in nature. What that did to us is that put us in a position where, you've got literally over 600 different versions of sick leave, 500 versions of something else. So building that into a system became very difficult, and they wanted to really do something around scheduling and forecasting. So the decision there was kind of break that off separately from time and attendance and do that in a system that would do both. So we kind of have a split model there. Within the US, they've got a time and attendance solution with a company called JDA, and then internationally, it's a bit of a mix still. We haven't quite made it all the way through implementations there on time and attendance. And then from a payroll perspective, we really wanted to get to a place where we could provide payroll with the same provider globally. And really, one of the few ways where that was possible was to go with ADP. So that was our choice there, was to go with ADP on payroll.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. How about your system for case or query management on top of Workday? Who do you use, and if anybody, and have you been able to kind of use that in more of a shared services model?
Yeah, so at this point now, we're actually using case management from a company called PeopleDoc. So PeopleDoc, actually, we found out about PeopleDoc when we were actually looking at digitizing employee files. That's really was their big area. So we ended up going with them for the process of digitizing the files, and then we had a provider when we first started, and that didn't work out. So PeopleDoc has a product called PeopleAsk, which is a case management type system. So that is who we have now. And yes, we do that. We use that in our shared service center environment. We use that for HRIS. And then we are actually going to be moving to using it for workforce planning. And then probably we're looking to make kind of more of a hubbed model for payroll in the international market. And we will probably then use it for that as well.
Great. Okay, so kind of shifting gears here a little bit, what HR data analytics functionality do you make use of and why?
That is an area that I will say has been one that we've been a little slow on. That's taken us a while, and some of that ties to what I mentioned around some of that organizational structure stuff. Is that certainly basic reporting that the business needs, things like that, obviously that we're doing, and producing for the business, but kind of really getting to the place of, what are the analytics, what are the metrics we want to measure by? We are actually really just in that process now. So trying to get to, and honestly, one of the biggest things we have to work our way through at this point is getting to the place of kind of globalizing the way that we look at metrics. Because everybody had something different, everybody wants to see something different. And getting to the place of coming to agreement on, here are the 3 to 5 things that we are going to agree are the most important metrics for us, and that is what we're going to deliver more broadly. And then, at a local level, obviously, you can manipulate data the way that you need to if you need to see additional. But what our goal is, and we're not there yet, is that we get to this place of, for each of the key areas, there's 3 to 5 main metrics, and that's what we will deliver kind of from like a leadership level within the business, and that's how we will kind of measure and score ourselves. And then we'll have one level down from there, which I'll call kind of more dashboards, which is, that top level will be more static presentation of numbers. That second level down is more, here are the different sorts of metrics that a particular function might need in order to do their job, in order to run their function. And that's going to be broader than 3 to 5. We don't want to go crazy with it, but we know it's going to have to be a little bit bigger than that. And then you kind of have that lower level, which is more the ad hoc, something that doesn't fall into those 2 buckets. Right now, I will tell you, we struggle with way too much ad hoc and not enough of the other pieces. So that definitely could have been one of the things on the what's next slide for us in terms of an area that we are putting a whole lot of focus on right now.
Great. There's a question around the design council. Who's involved? And then maybe you can also talk a little bit about the types of decisions that you're working on right now, whether they relate to metrics or other type of topics.
Sure. Well, this is something we're just kicking off. The idea behind design council is that we will have so when we built out our model at the beginning, we've kind of bucketed the HR function into a couple of different groups. We've got our centers of excellence, which is, comp, benefits, talent acquisition, OD, that kind of stuff. The business, or the HR business partners that sit in the business, our shared service center, and then, the general business, like beyond the HR function. So what we wanted to do is make sure that we had that representation in design council, and we kind of intentionally have taken it one level down. So members of the design council are not going to be part of the HR leadership team, but are going to be one level down from that. And 2 reasons. One, so that, one, it's a development opportunity for them. It's an opportunity for them to get more involved. And they're a little bit closer to the day-to-day, because some of the decisions we're making in those sessions, you really do need to understand how it's happening on a day-to-day basis. And then the idea is that, those HR business partners and COE members are going to rotate. Right now, we've got it on a 3-month cadence, but that's still a little bit up for debate in terms of what's the right timing there, so that others can get that same exposure. Kind of my secret behind the scenes wish for this is that it also helps to give the broader population a better understanding of, when you request to change something, it's not just as simple as telling you yes or no. And if we tell you no, it's not because we just want to say no, but there actually is this whole universe that we have to take a look at, because now that everything's connected, we need to understand what the impacts might be. And we've got to make sure that we're trying to stay global with things and things like that. So the hope is that we get a broader exposure to that, so there's better understanding as to why we make decisions the way that we make them.
That's great. Thank you so much. We've got a question about, you talked a little bit about some of the metrics that you're working on. How do you measure effectiveness and the impact that Workday's made? How do you kind of track that, within the organization?
So what we're starting to focus on now is getting better at providing the link between, really using the HRIS team, and we've kind of just revamped the way that we look at cases that come in, and trying to do a better job of kind of creating some categorization for those, so that we can start to look at where are the areas where we're getting most of our issues. So, in terms of like, how do we use that data to then make things better? So, if we're getting a ton of cases related to, changing a hire date, well, then we need to go back and look at that and see why that's happening. We get a lot of cases around, data correction and security and things like that, which is why we're taking a look at the way that we do position creation. And do we need to do that differently so that we can have an impact on driving those cases down? And then obviously taking a look at how many cases are coming in, how quickly are we resolving them, et cetera, and using that as a bit of a measure around how effective is the system at getting done what we need to get done. And then the next piece, I think the other piece of it is around like the adoption side of it is getting the general population more accustomed to doing things through the system versus not. I think one of the things going into this process that we thought was, everybody has a phone, everybody's on there for something all the time. Using your phone to do, some of this basic work admin would, of course, be what everybody wanted to do. That transition has been a little more difficult than I think we thought it would be. So really kind of looking at adoption and things like that to get people into that system to do the things the most efficient way versus, trying to go to somebody locally to try to resolve issues. So probably the biggest things from a systems perspective is that adoption rate, and then the cases and the types of cases that are coming in.
Great. Thank you. I think this is kind of going back to the slide where you talked about, kind of continuing to make improvements. How easy is it to change things once you've gone live?
Depends on what it is. There are some things that you can change. For example, if you can use what are called condition rules. So if it's, like for example, we went live with every requisition that got created and every position that got created needed an approval for it. And as we got about 6 months in, part of the business said, I don't want the additional approval step on requisitions. I don't need it. They know what they're doing. They can manage to their budget. I don't need to see that approval. But then we had another parts of the business saying, no, I still want the approval. You can't take it away. So, we had to find a way to try to satisfy both of those needs. And, through a condition rule, we were able to do that. So that was a pretty easy change. That wasn't very hard at all. But then, for example, one of the things that we're looking at now is, I mentioned when we first started, we took a look at our comp structure and how we built out our compensation. And, we made some pretty significant changes then, but now we want to go back and make some additional changes. And when you start to get at the core of, for example, you have a job profile catalog, which are all the jobs that exist in your organization. Now, if we want to start to change that, now that is obviously going to be a much more significant change. And not that it can't be done, but is going to be much more time consuming, and being very careful about when you do those things, what other knock-on effects are it going to have, is it going to have on other processes, et cetera.
Okay, great. Can you talk a little bit about the update process and your experience with that?
Update in terms of the twice a year updates?
Yes, that's what I'm getting. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's been really good. We haven't had any issues in terms of it causing, system issues or problems or adversely impacting, our current processes, et cetera. I mean, we do have, kind of the religious process of making sure that we go through and do the testing and, and take a look at things and make sure, that we're going to be prepared and ready for when it goes live, but it really has not been an issue at all.
Great. So, and actually, we're just about wrapping up on Q&A. Maybe two more questions. Can you just kind of remind the audience? So, how long have you been live? How many months? And since that time, how have the roles of your HR business partners, day-to-day tasks, kind of changed since that time?
We went live January 1st in 2017. So, I think over time it has definitely changed. When we first went live, the first 6 months were rocky. It was definitely a huge change. No matter what, you try to do ahead of time, nobody can really kind of comprehend, especially when it was such a significant change from essentially no access to a system to now you need to do many of the things in the system. So that was definitely a little bit rocky, and they probably spent a whole lot more time, focusing on that. But I think now we've leveled out and, they don't need to spend a lot of time on some of the admin work that they used to in the past. So, before, they were very involved in a lot of the processing, creating spreadsheets, all the things that you need to do to get things updated and changed. And now I think a lot of that has been able to be pulled away, along with the setup of the shared service center. So, basic questions, things like that, no longer hit their plate, but actually go to the shared service center instead. So I think they've definitely been able to change their roles a bit and focus much more on things like driving engagement and, making sure that we're focusing on developing and growing employees and giving them opportunities, things like that. I think we're not 100% of the way through our journey. I think there's still definitely opportunity there, but I think that's the shift that's been happening certainly over the last year or so.
That's great. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, Sherry. So maybe I'll ask you to kind of close. If you have any kind of words of wisdom that you want to share with the attendees today about your project or your experience with Workday, we'd love to hear it.
Sure. I think, some of them, I think we covered in the session. I mean, I think having a strong plan going in to this, and then depending on like your experience, prior to, if you've been through something like this before, I mean, if I think about if I ever had to do this again, oh my gosh, how different it would be. But I think for us going into it where we hadn't done that before, feeling really comfortable with your deployment team. And, I don't think we would have made it if we didn't have the strong team that we did. We worked very well together. We worked as one team. There was no Accenture or ABG during this implementation. It was the Workday implementation team. So I think that was key. The governance piece, making sure that you have the buy-in of the organization and the support of the organization, that when you need to push to get things through in order to hit your timelines, et cetera, that, that support is going to be there to make sure that the things happen that need to happen in order to keep you on track. And then I think, probably the third piece would be, as we went through this whole process, making sure that you're always keeping the business in mind, that end user, the people that are going to be actually accessing and using the system, because it could get very easy to get kind of wrapped up in the implementation of it all and getting very focused within the HR part of the business and not thinking about how is this actually going to work for the rest of the business. And kind of our mantra going through this was that we're not doing this for the HR team. One of the ancillary benefits of this is going to make our lives easier, but really this is about how do we better empower the business and set them up for success and, take out a lot of the non-value work that might be out there right now. And, kind of keeping that as your focus was key. That's great. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. We don't have any more questions coming in. So, I want to thank you all for joining today's webcast featuring Avis Budget Group. And I especially want to thank our guest, Sherry, for your time and sharing your story and your experience with all of us today. Once again, a recording of the webcast will be sent to all of you shortly. So thank you again for joining. On behalf of our team, have a great workday. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.